What's going on, everyone? There's been a lot of buzz around the trap buffs in the 3.17 patch notes, and I thought it would be interesting to look at the math of some of these skills and talk about exactly what's changed and what you can expect from them. I think a lot of people see bigger number adjustments to a skill and immediately think, wow, that's a massive buff. But for most of the buff trap skills in 3.17, they weren't buffed at all. And that's because the cluster trap support was nerfed to compensate for the damage increase that all the skills received. Pretty much every ice trap build in the current league uses cluster trap support. So let's look at that skill as an example. Pre-nerf, Ice Trap's max damage was 1347, and it had an added damage effectiveness of 200%. Cluster Trap support lowered your damage by 36%. So let's use 100 added damage from our gear, skills, etc. as our baseline and see what this would look like. We take 1347 plus 100 times 2 multiplied by 0.64, and this gives us 990 damage. We then multiply this by 3 since Cluster Trap allows us to throw 3 traps out at a time, and this gives us a total of 2,970 damage. Now, just like our previous equation, we start with the max damage of the skill, except this time we plug in the newly adjusted numbers. We start with 1,912 damage plus 100 times 2.9 multiplied by 0.45. And this also gives us 990 damage, which if multiplied by 3 again would give us the same 2,970 damage. But if we increase the added damage number from our gear, skills, and whatever else, we'll get slightly more damage out of the newly buffed skill, and that's primarily because of the increase to the added damage effectiveness. To be honest though, the damage increase is negligible at best, and in my opinion, not really worth noting. But what if you just don't use Cluster Trap support? What if you decide to use Swift Assembly instead? Swift Assembly wasn't nerfed at all, and it doesn't inherently reduce your damage by a multiplicative amount like Cluster Trap support does. But it also doesn't guarantee that you'll throw more than one trap at a time. So what does this look like? Well, this is pretty easy to figure out. We just take our last equation and remove the 55% less damage at the end from cluster traps. So we have 1912 plus 100 multiplied by 2.9 for a total of 2,202 damage. We then need to apply the damage that Swift Assembly adds in the form of additional traps thrown. The wiki tells us that skills supported by Swift Assembly throw 0.6 additional traps on average. That equation looks like 18% plus 2 times 12% plus 3 times 6% equals 60%, or 0.6. So we just take our total damage and multiply it by this number, which looks like 2,202 multiplied by 1 plus 0.6, and we end up with 3,523 damage. That's a pretty significant damage increase. 18% more damage on average to be exact. And this isn't even including the trap mastery that gives you a 5% chance to throw up to 4 additional traps, which is worth investing in if you're going down the route of using Swift Assembly. But an important thing to keep in mind here is that we are working with the average of Swift Assembly. It's possible that you could sometimes deal less damage and sometimes deal more on any given throw of your traps.
Sometimes may be good, sometimes may be shit.
Also, the fact that you aren't consistently throwing out 3 or more traps at a time might be a problem for other trap skills such as Lightning Trap because of the lack of coverage. I think that's part of the reason why Ice Trap is being looked at as a potential league starter for so many people, because 1 or 2 traps can be more than enough to clear a pack of enemies if your AoE is scaled enough to do so. Another thing to consider is the max number of traps you can have out at once. This really only matters in scenarios where you can preload your traps before a boss encounter. But in those cases, Swift Assembly has absolutely no added value. Of course, after that initial phase, it becomes valuable again, but for that first burst of damage, it doesn't do much, effectively making it a dead link. But Cluster Traps, on the other hand, allows you to have 5 additional traps out at once. So what would this look like for our initial burst of damage? Let's just say that your max number of traps with Cluster Trap support is 29. All we need to do is apply our original damage number by this number, which is 990 multiplied by 29, and that comes to 28,710 damage. Now we compare this with our burst with Swift Assembly, which is 2,202 damage multiplied by 24, and this gives us 52,848 damage. That's 85% more damage on the initial burst. Obviously, getting to your max number of traps could be somewhat of a pain if you don't have enough trap throwing speed, and or you get unlucky with how many traps you're throwing out. But realistically, it shouldn't be too difficult for you to achieve this. So yeah, Ice Trap is looking pretty good. It'll just be a matter of how fluid the build plays while mapping using Swift Assembly. This is something that you could easily test before league launch though, so if you have the time to level a character, or you already have a trapping character lying around in standard or something, then it might be worth testing the skill out with Swift Assembly. But personally, I think people might be sleeping on Fire Trap. Fire Trap builds don't necessarily need to use Cluster Traps or Swift Assembly support, so you can use the 6 support that helps you deal more damage. Worst case scenario, you do end up having to use Swift Assembly while mapping, but you can swap it out in boss fights for something that would be more effective against a single target, which isn't really an option for other trap skills like Ice Trap or Lightning Trap. Also, you could do some hipster shit like playing a Chieftain Fire Trapper. Would it be good? I have no idea, but it's definitely something that I would enjoy tinkering with because I'm a filthy little hipster myself. But yeah guys, TLDR, use Swift Assembly this league, but be careful because it might not work very well with certain traps. And don't forget about the mastery that gives you a chance to throw 4 additional traps. That's a decent multiplier for your average damage when using Swift Assembly. This video is definitely different than the usual type of content that I make, so I was very methodical in my research. But if I mess something up, feel free to call me a bald dumbass in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe for more gaming related content.